Well, earlier I spoke to the Chief Executive of the Youth Justice Board, Stephanie Roberts-Bibby, who gave evidence to the Southport inquiry. I started by asking for her reaction to the report's findings.
I obviously have been around the evidence and saw other witnesses give their evidence, and very, very sadly from that, I'm not surprised by the number of failed opportunities that the Chair articulated today in his briefing.
I think it's fair to say that the Chair has not shied away from assigning blame here. Part of the failure lay with Axel Rudakubana's parents. How did that sit with you as somebody who spends time with young people, with their families, getting some idea of what goes on inside a home? How does that sit with you?
Clearly, I think, parents have a responsibility, let's be very, very clear, and there is more that family could have done to identify the potential risks and harm that could be caused. But I don't think any of us know what we would do unless we were in that set of circumstances. And there is clearly others could have been and should have been doing more to understand the conditions in which that family were living and how that was then playing out in their interactions both within the family home and outside.
So that is a key learning really from
Absolutely.
What has been looked into as part of this inquiry.
I think there are key learnings across all elements of the system, and the youth justice system is at the end of that system actually. And our position and the evidence is very clear. We need to be intervening earlier when children have unmet needs and risks, and we are clear that when children's needs are unmet, they can cause significant harm, and we've seen that in this instance. I mean, we need to not get away from the fact that that this was an absolute tragic set of circumstances, but we must, and for the families of those three girls, we must learn, and we must learn at pace.
Yes.
Around the systems, processes, training, and indeed cultures in which our public services are offered.
Well, let's move on to that, because another key failing here was serial buck passing between the agencies, loss of vital information about risk of harm. How easy is that, do you think, to remedy?
I think you will have seen, obviously, the Chair's 67 recommendations, and certainly we are very supportive of supporting the inquiry in Part 2 to explore Part 1 about how a single agency could be responsible for holding cases in a different way, so that there is real clarity over who is responsible for what and at what given time. And one of the things that was very clear to me, and I think I said this in my evidence, was that there didn't appear to be a plan about what was going to happen next. So if and everyone should have a plan. We should always have a plan for if there is a risk. What are we going to collectively do? Who's going to do what by when? If there's then no change in behaviour, then what's the escalation route? And what's going to happen next? And I didn't get a sense of what would have happened. That anyone was gripping that, and that there was going to be an intervention that would then prevent escalation.
Also, I suppose we should think of the wider context here and the fiscal reality that a lot of these agencies are being slimmed down, they're being rolled into one another. Is that going to complicate what is needed to be achieved here? Well,
I think we need to always be clear that change preoccupies people. And I'm not saying change isn't necessary. So we should always have our eye on what's not working and what's the problem we're trying to solve. And then we can then work through that. Now, there isn't an endless bucket of money for public services. And those of us that work in public services are acutely aware of that. But there is more that can be done without, in this instance, further investment, because some of this is around looking at what was known, how was it shared, who knew about it, and professional curiosity. In my world, costs nothing.
It feels like an appropriate time to talk about as well the role of attributing conduct to a diagnosis on the autism spectrum. From your experience, is that something that happens a lot? Does closer scrutiny need to come into play here with the number of diagnoses out there and what they mean, because it's a broad spectrum, isn't it?
It is a broad spectrum, but I think we need to be very careful. This was an act of serious violence. That wasn't caused by ASD or autism. That may have complicated and made it much more challenging for the professionals working with this family, but that wasn't the reason. And there is no link that between with autism being an indicator of risk.
No, I think the chair was quite careful to point that out, but I think what he was getting at was because it was attributed to autism wrongly and almost lazily, it then got sort of moved along or almost excused.
I think that talks to my point about professional curiosity. You can give something a diagnosis or a label, and I'm not minimising it saying that, but that doesn't detract from the behaviour. So if a behaviour is still going to cause harm, the question should be then so what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do about it that prevents it manifesting in causing harm to others, whether, again, that be in the family home or, this instance, both the family home and then the broader community. So how are those professionals coming together to respond to address the risk that has been collectively identified, because going forward there must be better information sharing so that people can have the information that they need. It was there, it was available.
So going into phase 2, what gives you confidence that this won't happen again, if anything?
We can never say something won't happen again. I think we need to be being very, very, honest about, working with people. However, this has been such a catastrophically tragic case that everyone must learn. Everyone who works in those agencies in public service must understand their responsibility, and it is a dual responsibility, and I want to be really clear about that, around not criminalising children unnecessarily, but managing the risk that children can pose. And they can be highly dangerous, again, as we've seen here, as they grow into young adulthood, when their needs are not met and addressed, and when they are not influenced in terms of their identity, and having really key people around them to make sure that they are not adopting pro-criminal identity, but they are thinking about themselves in a different way. We've got no insight into how he was thinking about himself. We have no insight into what was going on in his world. No. And I find that really, really hard to believe when there were so many professionals working with him.